Hello everybody, welcome back to Reaper Minis TV. And as I talked about at the end of the previous episode, the first thing we're going to look at in this episode is a new figure, or it's actually almost more like a basing or diorama piece that I'm going to use in a new Warlord army that I'm building. And the first thing to look at is the piece itself, and that's this one here. It's called Dead Man's Chest. It's a single piece miniature, and on it you can see there's two skeletons and a chest of gold, and one of them's reaching up to grab some of the gold and the other's kind of draped over it. The two figures that are by the chest appear to have been there for quite a while because they're down to just bones now, skeletons. There's a sword on the base. There's also a very good sandy texture to the base itself. And if you wanted to use this as a base for a larger miniature, it almost fits onto a 40mm square base. You would have to trim just a tiny bit off of a couple of the rounded sides to make it fit flush, but I think you could use some green stuff and sculpt in some more sandy area to make it look just fine. If it just barely doesn't fit on a 40mm, then it would fit on a 50mm square perfectly with room to spare, and then you just have to use some putty to finish in some sandy parts wherever there's a void left by where the base isn't. So by itself, the Dead Man's Chest is a nice little piece. You can maybe put it in a dungeon somewhere as a trap, have the treasure chest as a trap for unsuspecting party members. You could use it as part of a diorama. You could use it as a base for a larger miniature. But what it did for me is inspire me to build a Razig army for Warlord. And you can see my unpainted Razig army here. Lots of guys in it, and you'll notice right away there's lots of guys with missile weapons. Now, I'm building this as sort of a themed army, and it could just do horribly in the game, and that's really okay with me because I think it's going to be a cool theme. I'm going to have nothing but guns, if that's what I can kind of work out my army list to have. So I'm going to have the Marines, the skeleton Marines with the rifles, and then the pirate crew members with the pistols and the cutlasses, and then a couple of the characters who all have missile weapons, and then as you can see I've got three soul cannons here, just depending on the configuration of the army list on how many I actually get into the list itself. Now, why this might just do horribly in Warlord is I am building a completely ranged combat-centered army for close combat skirmish game. Now that's not to say that ranged combat doesn't have a place in Warlord, because it does, but I'm very much putting all my eggs in one basket here. There's also another thing that I'm going to be doing with this army that I probably should have decided on, or wish I would have thought about before I based everybody. And that is, I want to do some water effects on the bases. And the square Warlord bases have a nice feature where they have a little indentation or a lip that comes up the side a little bit, and it leaves you a little bit of room, just a tiny bit, in what is a recess of the base itself. And I want to use some water effects to make it look like they're coming out of the surf, and get some really fine sand to use for basing in some places. And if that wasn't bad enough, what I then decided I wanted to do is have some of them deep in the water just coming out. So what I'm going to end up doing is unbasing probably all of the models, and then taking some and cutting some in half to where they're like waist deep in the water. And then I'm going to take some and cut them off at the knees, and maybe one or two and cut them off right at the neck to where they're barely coming out of the water, and maybe one or two of the guys with the rifles just part of their upper torso and the rifle sticking out like they're coming out of the water. And for anybody who's worried about the problem of keeping their powder dry if they're submerged or underwater, I'd go ahead and say that, well, they're already undead pirates, so if they've solved the riddle of death or undeath, I think keeping their powder dry or worrying about regular powder versus magical weapons, I think they'll be okay. So I've got an ambitious project ahead of me, and I'll keep you up with little snippets here and there as it progresses, and hopefully by Gen Con or maybe even ReaperCon next year, I'll get these guys on the table. Okay, back to some regular reviews now, and these first couple are all from the Chronoscope line. This guy here is a Mega-Mutant. It's a large figure, larger than a human, not quite ogre-sized, but kind of in between the two. Two-piece model where his right hand is a separate piece. It comes with a wrist-mounted crossbow or mini crossbow, and in his left hand he's carrying a pretty hefty hammer. It almost looks like it's a piece off the internal workings of a car or a big rig or something like that, off the engine maybe. You can see that his right shoulder pad looks like it's made from a tire tread or part of a tire, and he's wearing bits and pieces of armor, look like plate and other things that are just kind of thrown together to give him a little bit of protection. He definitely has a bit of a Fallout 3 vibe to him, and I think that looks really cool. You could also use him in a more modern setting if you wanted to use him as a super villain in a game of Champions or Mutants and Masterminds or whatnot. You could also use him in a sci-fi game or in a more post-apocalyptic themed game, which I really think is more the intent of the figure given the theme, but use him however you want. I do hope that Reaper releases some more of these guys. I'd like to see a guy with a great big chain gun and maybe even a couple other poses for this type of Mega-Mutant. So, very cool figure here. I look forward to seeing some more of them. This next guy is a single-piece miniature. His name is Stillwater, and if you remember from the fairly recent movie Zombieland, where everybody had a name, at least initially, based on where they came from, I would bet you this guy's from Stillwater, Oklahoma. He's carrying 2 machine pistols and has a machete strapped to his left leg. Got a cowboy hat on, and also looks like jeans, a denim jacket, and a pair of boots. Not really any other gear or anything on the model, but he does have some long sideburns and a bushy mustache just to add a little more character to the model. There was some cleaning needed. There were bits of flash on the model and a couple visible mold lines, but no defects or anything like that, so he cleaned up in just a couple of minutes. The stitching on the jeans is sculpted in to where the zipper line and the back pockets, and even on the denim jacket, the buttonholes and the various stitching along the panels of the jacket itself are sculpted in, so that'll add a bit of extra detail if you put a wash on the model. You could obviously use him in just about any kind of modern game, whether there's zombies in it or not, but I think he'd drop right in perfectly into a game of all things zombie, or all flesh must be eaten, or any kind of post-apocalyptic kind of adventure game. Here we have Sandwoman, a one-piece figure that you could use either as a superhero or supervillain, pretty much take your pick on that. She's wearing a skin-tight one-piece jumpsuit like you see most superheroes wearing, but her whole right side, leg and arm, and even over on the left side a little bit, are turning into sand. She's balling up a giant sand fist to hit you with, and reminiscent obviously of Sandman from the most recent Spider-Man movie, but don't think Reaper could really do a Sandman, so Sandwoman, next best thing I guess. Cleaning was very limited to just a couple of faint mold lines on her leg, inner and outer side of her left leg, and then on just part of her left arm. But she cleaned up real easy, real quick. I think she would paint up pretty quickly and easily with a couple of basic colors, and you got an addition to a superhero game. These next 2 figures are both from the Warlord line, and they come from the Isingstead army out of the Savage North book. First up is Kaya the Reaper, and it's a single-piece female model. She's carrying a large spear, and the spear is done in the same style as the Frost Giants. They're really big spears. Now hers is large for a human, probably not as big if you put it up against the Frost Giants, but still it's a big barbed, icy kind of spear. Now Kaya is significantly larger than, say, your normal human-sized model. She looks a little bit thicker, a little bit taller, just all around proportionally a little bit bigger than the rest of the human models, and especially the next one we're going to see, which goes in the same army. So she's wearing a lot of fur. She has mittens on, the kind you wore when you were a little kid that didn't have any finger holes or anything. Her arms look pretty bare, but she does have leggings on. You can see the stitching that's been sculpted into the model itself, and a couple of skulls on her belt as trophies to go along with a knife and a pouch, actually a couple pouches that are on her belt. Now, she goes along with, but sold separately, an Isingstead Spearman. And this is also a single-piece miniature, and he looks similar to hers. His spear is in the same style. He's got the same kind of mittens on, same kind of clothing and armor and heavy winter gear on, but he is considerably smaller in terms of height and just general bulk of the model. The Spearman is basically just normal human-sized, and she's going to be a little bit bigger than that. Now, she's not ogre-sized or anything like that, but she is pretty comparable in size to the Mega-Mutant that we saw a little bit earlier, so maybe half ogre-ish kind of size, if that makes any sense to you. Okay, everybody, thanks for watching this episode of Reaper Minis TV. See you next time.